Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us, the Natural Areas Association. For those of you who are new to us, we are a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. If you'd like to check out our website, you can use the QR code in this slide. NAA's mission is to get quality science and best practices into the hands of those who make an impact on the ground by sharing applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge transfer. And we do this in multiple ways. We have created a YouTube channel with over 300 pieces of content that relates to the work that you do so that we can be accessible wherever you're located, wherever you are in career, wherever you are in your practice, and key here, whenever you have time. We also share the Natural Areas News. Watch your inbox twice a month. It is a compendium of research, articles, funding, all kinds of information that will be helpful to you in your work. And now, so that we can get started, let's introduce our speakers. So Mason Heberling is the Associate Curator of Botany at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. He is the botany curator and plant ecologist studying the functional ecology of understory plant species and temperate forests, especially in the context of climate change and introduced species invasions. As museum curator, he seeks to facilitate and broaden the use of natural history collections by students, researchers, and the public. As a museum-based researcher, he uses zoobaryum specimens and field experiments and observational data to understand basic plant function and complex ecological interactions. His research program explores a diverse range of topics under the umbrella of global change, biology, and museum collections. And he's being joined today by Dr. Rachel Reeb. Rachel Reeb is a postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Mellon Museum of Natural History, a recent graduate of the University of Pittsburgh. Rachel's research focuses on the biology and impacts of introduced plants with emphasis on phenology. At Carnegie Mellon Museum of Natural History, she's coordinating a new cross-departmental and cross-organizational project on invasive plant species communication. So I am going to turn it over to our speakers at this time. So thank you, Mason.
Okay, cool. Thanks for joining. I don't see the right screen anymore, but I saw something like 160 plus participants, so no pressure. Thanks for joining. Hopefully it's worth your time. Thanks, Maura and the Natural Areas Association for inviting us to give this talk and for tuning in. I don't know if it's snowing in your area, but it is today, which made it, I had to play outside with my kids, which made it hard to focus to come in to give this, but I'm excited too. So yeah, it's just next slide here, if I get this right. Cool. So when Maura asked, we were really excited to give this presentation, which is just kind of a very exploratory webinar about a new project that we're starting with, which Rachel will really dive in more too. I'll just give a little bit of an origin story. And when Maura asked, about the, details about the talk, send an example picture. It's like, well, what do you pick? What introduced plant do you pick? And here is the one that ended up on the advertisement, Lesser Celandine in Pittsburgh, Ficaria verna. Some of you may know it as Ranunculus ficaria. And I think it's kind of an apt example, at least locally, of a plant that's really spreading, kind of just in front of your eyes. And it's also a plant that is really quite beautiful in many aspects, which makes it interesting. So kind of this kind of juxtaposition of beauty and fear or impact was one reason why I picked this. And we'll give some shout outs later too to some others involved in the project here too. So yeah, and I guess, yeah, what was the other thing I wanted to say? You don't know. I wanted to say huge thanks to the Richard King Mellon Foundation, who is supporting a lot of this new project that we're doing at the museum and supporting Rachel and I in our ambitious endeavors to explore this kind of really socially and scientifically complicated topic of plant invasions. And the timing of our project is really quite great in many aspects, if you ever could have good timing for such a project. And I wanted to start kicking off with this. Many of you may know the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, kind of a mouthful. Recently in 2019, did this intergovernmental kind of assessment of the major threats globally to biodiversity. You can kind of think of this kind of intergovernmental, global organization, kind of like the IPCC is for climate change, that the IPBES is for biodiversity. And one interesting thing that came out of this kind of global assessment, or kind of the major impacts to biodiversity loss, and among them being, invasions. So yeah, sorry about that. Okay, I swear my brain's mostly on right here today. Clicking next. Okay. And so this topic of invasions is one that, as an invasion biologist, both Rachel and I have thought a lot about, and it's a confusing topic. And so there are so many terms. This was kind of a fun little slide to put together for this talk of like all of the different, not even all of them, but some of them just kind of stream of consciousness, typing up different terms that have similar or related meanings. And so anytime we talk about invasives, non-natives, introductions, we kind of want to, we wanted to start this presentation with a little bit of a, but what is invasive anyway? And we think of native species as those that are naturally evolved within an area, and even that has some subjectivity or some nuance to understanding it. And then we'll use the term introduced or non-native interchangeably as species which have been transported by humans in particular to an area outside of their kind of naturally evolved range. And then the real kicker, of course, is, well, what is invasive? And we define invasive species as those introduced species which cause harm to the environment, economy, and or humans. And Rachel made this slide. Rachel, you're back. Hopefully I'm not butchering what you what you had intended to say, because she does a great job with this definition. Yeah, no problem.
I just went and reset my Wi-Fi because I
couldn't
see the whole
well,
thing.
Welcome.
Yeah.
I stole your 2 slides, but anyway. So invasive being very kind of like this, this kind of is very important, definitely for land managers, of course, what is invasive, and also for policymakers, and just in the science of invasion generally. And this kind of asterisk by harm, of course, has some subjectivity, what organisms belong and what organisms don't belong, which organisms are in place and which aren't in place. So though there are some strict definitions on what is invasive, that does vary, and there is some nuance. And in our case, we were kind of going to be talking about invasions as in the relatively broad sense of species that cause harm in some way. So the timing of this project also is really phenomenal too, in the fact that this project started several months ago, and about that time too, the IPBES did another kind of follow-up from that global assessment in 2019, specifically on invasives. This was a big effort across many different countries, and so the timing was really great for our more local regional work that we're doing on invasives, to give it this global context. And some take-homes of that were direct quotes from this report: invasive species are a major threat to nature, nature's contributions to people, and good quality of life. Globally, invasive species and their impacts are increasing rapidly and are predicted to continue to rise in the future. So continues to be an increasing and major conservation concern. Many of this is probably not new at all to the group, but are really kind of key take homes, especially for policymakers in this really comprehensive report. Another, invasive alien species and their negative impacts can be prevented and mitigated through effective management. So thinking of it being a human problem, and therefore there are human solutions. And public awareness, this was one that really stands out in our project, is this kind of take home of public awareness, commitment, engagement, and capacity building are crucial for the prevention and control of invasive species. And then Rachel, did you want to take this other kind of unique part of the assessment?
Certainly, yeah. We will also want to highlight the fact that the IPBES is very much placed a lot of emphasis as well on the importance of not only broad public engagement for engaging in invasive species solutions, but also broad public engagement across a variety of different community context and demographics as well. And some sort of quotes that stood out to me through reading this report was one that said invasive alien species can add to marginalization and inequity, including in some contexts, gender and age differentiated impacts. And importantly, too, a major challenge they face is collaboratively addressing the management of biological invasions, for which there are conflicting values among sectors, stakeholders, and Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is a significant global policy change that we are working on.
Cool, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so we're kind of at this stage with this global assessment of really informing the project, which we really didn't introduce yet, but bear with me. So I wanted to give a little bit of origin behind this project and kind of where I come from as an invasion biologist, as a plant ecologist, thinking about invasions. And so one thing that early, this was in the first or second year of my PhD, studying invasive plants, hadn't really thought terribly very much about kind of the larger context of invasives, other than native good, non-native bad kind of mentality. And so at that time in 2011, this kind of opinion piece came out in Science led by Mark Davis and a bunch of other invasion ecologists and plant ecologists, kind of poignantly asking, does origin even matter, and to not judge species on their origins. And here's a quote from that: "We must embrace the fact of novel ecosystems and incorporate many alien species into management plans, rather than just trying to achieve the impossible goal of eradicating them or drastically reducing their abundance. Indeed, many of the species that we think of are native are actually alien, kind of from a more public sense." And that kind of strikes, and it still strikes true to me when I learn a new plant, which I'm always learning new plants. One of the first questions I have is is it native or not? And that somehow, changes my perception of the plant, which is kind of interesting. Now, when this came out, I was kind of immediately like, oh, I study invasions, this is kind of ridiculous nonsense, so to speak. And then as I think of it more, it's well, there is some really interesting points here of thinking that kind of this dichotomy between native and non-native isn't always so clear in a management, especially in a management setting. And then around the same time too, there were another kind of string of papers, which has continued since then, of the idea of, well, can non-native plants be a good thing? And again, as an invasion biologist, younger, starting graduate student, thinking, all non-natives must be bad. And so these kind of papers were kind of interesting in that. And this conversation continues with often led by some of the same authors over 10 years ago, but with kind of this similar conversation of understanding the contributions of non-native species and plants. And then around the same time, for decades now, there's also been some conversation of well, what is native anyway, and who are we to decide what should be where and when, and these kind of conversation. Some have some merit to them, and so thinking is invasion biology racist, or are we making these and then of course making the connections either implicitly or explicitly with human immigration and these kind of connections. And again, this was as kind of a quote objective scientist, I wasn't really thinking about this broader conversation or some of the implications of the science. Just kind of interesting. And then fast forward a couple of years to my current position as the curator of botany here at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. I had Botany Hall is a major exhibit hall in the museum, which is quite awesome. And when I arrived there, there was kind of this interesting opportunity to look at Botany Hall. And Botany Hall was constructed almost 100 years ago now, which is really unique. We know many classic dioramas kind of have animals kind of in the foreground and plants are relegated to the background. This hall, like some other halls, have the plants in the foreground, which is really interesting, and in a lot of plant-based education opportunities therein. And these are very kind of idealized dioramas, kind of showing the major biomes of North America in the case of our museum, all kind of absent and devoid of a lot of how we know ecosystems to be today, in particular interactions with humans and changes from humans. There is one diorama, the newest diorama that opened in 1976, this kitchen herb diorama, which had did have and still does have a shows some influence of humans, which is interesting, and also has a label that has a commentary on non-native plants, which is kind of interesting. I'll just read it to you. This label's not up anymore, but this kind of started the current project. And this label said, most of the species shown here are not native to the United States. Many were brought over by settlers. Several have been developed by plant breeders, and others have escaped into the wild to become a fragrant part of our landscape. And as an invasion biologist starting at the museum, I of course wanted more conversations and this topic of plant invasions to be more visible to the public. And so I definitely narrowed in on this label, which has its pros and cons, not necessarily saying it was bad or anything. I mean, there's some good positive points about it. But it also is kind of interesting. It kind of left you with this feeling that as a visitor, with no other context, that becoming a fragrant part of the landscape, this kind of a neutral to positive judgment, which is kind of interesting. And so we had the opportunity, funded through the National Science Foundation, to redo some of Botany Hall. So we didn't really, we didn't touch the historic dioramas, which are awesome, but we had an opportunity to redo the entryway to make it more visible to the public, and to also redo some of these labels. So it's kind of like, it was an exciting opportunity to kind of tackle this. This kind of desire to get more invasion biology out on the floor at the museum, and as an opportunity to communicate some of the research we were doing. So yeah, and so again, the forests of Pittsburgh are changing, and the representation in these dioramas aren't necessarily inaccurate, but they don't necessarily paint this whole picture of a lot of what current ecosystems look like. So we had the opportunity to, again, this is just one label of probably 25 that kind of is part of this origin story. It's kind of interesting. And so as we were doing this was, let's see what we ended up as a first draft here, if you can see this. So invasive species like knotweed can take over the landscape and outcompete native plants for resources. This early specimen came from nearby Frick Park, now introduced the plant now lines Pittsburgh's waterways. And at the time, this was the time as we were drafting this label, and as exhibits, collaborators and exhibits were drafting the label. It was a time of heightened anti-immigration sentiments and violence, to be quite honest, and that continues today. And again, kind of with my own blinders on, I really didn't think about this at all. And so upon reading, sharing some early drafts of some of the label rewrites, one of which being with Nicole Heller, who's the curator of Anthropocene Studies, and Taiji Nelson, who was an educator at the time at the museum, kind of brought it up. Even just reading that simple knotweed, like, ooh, this might, especially at the time of the deployment of this new label, that there may be some parallels in the media of like, East Asian plants are bad, and therefore, East Asian immigrants are bad, and this type of thing. And so it was kind of an interesting opportunity too. We brought this to our research lab group, which was at the time Sarah Kidding was just across the road at University of Pittsburgh, now at Yale. But we had a lot of conversations with her lab group as well, thinking about invasion. And again, I almost took it personally, like, oh, am I racist? Am I like, kind of like turns your study of invasions kind of up on its, what hadn't really been questioned or before then. And I hadn't really thought about that. So yeah. And so again, this early draft of invasive species like knotweed can take over landscape and outcompete native plants for resources was kind of changed to this kind of outcompeting native plants and taking over, and like this language was changed slightly. And again, it might sound like a relatively minor change, and it was one I was honestly a little bit upset about at the time. Not terribly upset, but just kind of like, oh geez, I guess, sure. It wasn't like, I was kind of complacent about it. And this change instead to originally, and again, this is just like a couple of sentences, we really were limited anyway. And so that was one part of the label. And then we also included, and this is the current text of kind of this kind of inspiration for action. So botanists often search for positive actions we can take, big and small. For instance, we know that planting local species in gardens supports healthy ecosystems. And I really liked this kind of where this landed, but at the same sense, I wasn't really satisfied. Again, this was one label of many. The topic is still not really addressed at the museum in the exhibits. And I wasn't really satisfied with it. It was kind of like, from it being a strong statement of kind of like invasions are a problem, to kind of a neutral or even positive statement. But this really brought it to my mind, and Rachel at the time was a part of Sarah's Kiving's lab group, and we had been talking about this too, kind of brought it to our mind that it's like, yeah, it is complex. We knew it was scientifically complex, but we weren't really thinking about how our communication about the science, especially to the broader public and among other scientists, is complicated, and more complicated than I envisioned. But that left me with and I still am at this point. That's why I kind of during this project, this kind of science communication project about invasives, thinking about, on one hand, invasives are an urgent environmental and cultural concern. That's well evinced from many different studies and this IPBES global assessment. I mean, there's a lot of rigorous science behind this that of course, there's a serious conservation concern. But on the other hand, sometimes the way we talk about invasions, or the language we use, even just the terminology or even the phrasing, may be misaligned with that of modern audiences, and particularly at places like museums or nature centers or other places where you're really interacting with the public. Like the words we use matter, and we don't want to just be like, non-natives bad, natives good, kind of like almost nationalist language. And so, but again, we kind of don't want to, we don't want to conflate one end or the other, that like invasions are like the worst thing in the world and we are so screwed, to the other hand, of being novel ecosystems, whatever, it is what it is, kind of, it's not a major concern. So that's kind of where we landed. So again, how do we convey concern and inspire action without kind of falling back on these ways of speaking about it that may be inaccurate in some cases, and in other cases simply are just kind of a put off and aren't very inclusive in the way we talk about, what should be here and what shouldn't be here and how we manage. So yeah, so that is kind of the long origin story of where we landed on this project. And I'm really excited that the museum is now kind of tackling this. And so I wanted to, and this is where Rachel came on board officially, formally, as a postdoc at the museum. And I wanted to kick it over to you, Rachel, now to really talk about the some of the project goals and some of the first take homes of this science communication project. I think you can kick me off now, Rachel. Is that how that works? Or
Yeah.
you want to do that? How's your Wi-Fi? Or do you want me to just advance?
I think if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just like interject if at any point it's looking good right now. Yeah, apologies again. It's snowing today in Pittsburgh, and apparently that just means that the internet can't work anywhere. So I'm having some logistical difficulties, but right now it's working great. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a try. Yeah, so the goal of this invasive species campaign here at the Museum of Natural History is very broadly to facilitate discussions with the public about invasive species. And we want to be able to help our community build towards a set of common beliefs. Those beliefs being that invasive species impact our community and the environment. We want people to understand that invasive species impact our daily lives. We want people to be able to talk about invasive species in their community. And we want folks to feel like there are actions they can take to reduce the impact of invasive species in their area. We have a really great interdisciplinary core team of people working on this project here at the museum. We span the botany department as well as the exhibitions department, education department, and the marketing department. And there's also a broader ecosystem of folks working here at the museum who are working on similar topics in science communication related to the Anthropocene, as well as climate change communication, who have been really wonderful collaborators. And folks here have been able to contribute an interdisciplinary expertise in a range of subjects, including invasion biology, science education, policy, ethics, and a lot more. So the museum has a variety of different sort of deliverable goals that we are working on over the next year and some change. We are planning to open up a physical museum exhibit about invasive species. So an exhibit that's explicitly dedicated to educating the public about invasive species in Pittsburgh. We're producing online educational material. We're working on visitor programming and in-person events for the public. And then particularly relevant to our seminar topic today, we're doing work to develop best practices internally for inclusive and ethical programming on invasive species. And we're also working to connect with regional organizations in our area to develop shared messaging and sort of work together towards enhancing our invasive species communication goals. Early on in this project, we realized that, rather than conducting our invasive species awareness campaign in a complete vacuum, that it would be really important for us instead to interface with other science communication experts in the city, because of course, a lot of folks are talking about and interfacing on the topic of invasive species with the public. So earlier in the year, in November, we conducted the first of what we're planning to be a series of workshop events here in Pittsburgh, where we've been getting together science communicators into the same room. And we had a couple of goals for that workshop event. The first was to share knowledge about our collective messaging on the topic of invasive species. And then we did a lot of work together to discuss strategies for promoting inclusive and ethical and effective communication on invasive species with the public. And then we also, of course, explored ways of collaborating and sort of increasing the collective impact of our outreach. We had a really positive, when we put out the call for this workshop event, we had a really positive response from organizations in the area. And we ended up with an excellent turnout. We had 45 science communication experts representing about 20 different organizations in the Pittsburgh area. The folks that were in the room that day held a huge variety of different types of expertise. We had environmental educators, restoration ecologists, invasion biologists, trail technicians, horticulturalists, sustainability coordinators, and a whole lot more, all there in the room contributing their expertise. And it was really exciting to see the huge range of different types of communication programming that people were conducting to interface with the public on the topic of invasive species. It ranged from youth summer camps to hands-on land management training with people who were engaging in invasive species management, social media, and much more. Based on a preliminary survey that we sent out prior to the workshop, we collected a lot of information about what types of audiences these different organizations serve. Excuse me. And again, we were excited to see that collectively across our organizations, we do serve a wide range of different types of audience demographics in the Pittsburgh area, ranging from a wide variety of age ranges to educational backgrounds, and also our organizations reach audiences across a urban to rural gradient. Also in some preliminary survey questions, we asked the organizations to describe what it is exactly that their audiences value about nature and make them, which influence their beliefs about invasive species and is likely to influence their motivation to participate in invasive species solutions, right? And having a deep understanding of the different nature-based values that are held by our audience members are of course important, because it affects the ways that we as science communicators talk about invasive species with that person. So for example, the way that we might engage with a gardener who might prioritize maintaining the aesthetic beauty of their natural spaces is going to be, the way we talk to a gardener about an invasive species might be different from the way that we talk to a person who draws a lot of moralistic value from nature and might be primarily concerned about preserving biodiversity or minimizing human impacts on the environment. Unsurprisingly, we saw that across our organizations, again, at this workshop, our audience members held a huge diversity in different types of values and were motivated in very different ways to sort of engage with and be interested in the topic of invasive species. The science communicators in our area are doing an immense amount of work to understand their audience members on a really deep fundamental level. And they're really skilled at explaining this invasive species problem from a variety of different types of angles and using different types of storytelling techniques. But even still, a large part of our discussion hinged around the fact that, it continues to be an innate challenge in figuring out how to inspire collective action across diverse groups of stakeholders. But I just wanted to say that based on our workshop discussions, I pulled out a few common themes that we're going to discuss today, related specifically to the challenges of creating both ethical and inclusive communication practices on the topic of invasive species. And of course, one major issue that we discussed that Mason's already primed us a little bit for is this topic about the prevalence of ineffective or outdated messaging strategies related to invasive species. And just to give as a little bit of a primer and to get folks, get the wheels turning for folks, I selected just 2 short examples of what I consider to be a pretty typical framework that we use as science communicators to frame the invasive species problem for to the public and convey sort of a sense of importance or urgency. So as you're watching through these, sort of think about what are the different mechanisms or strategies that these videos are using to get the public's interest and attention.
What kind of invasive pest could possibly move through the internet? Order an uninspected plant online, and the answer just might be me.
Invasive pests are a real threat. Ordering or mailing uninspected agricultural items is bad news. Leave hungry pests behind. Find out how at hungrypests.com/online.
And this is another quick one. This is an invasive species exhibit at the Connecticut River Museum.
I'm Denise DeCenzo in the WFSB Channel 3 studio with breaking news right now. Earlier this morning, invaders were spotted on the waters of Long Island Sound and throughout the Connecticut River Valley. The invaders appear to be aliens, and they are coming by land, air, and water. Government officials are urging the public to stay calm and report any sightings. Scientists from the University of Connecticut have been observing their plot, which centers on infiltrating our planet under seemingly normal conditions. Once established, they reproduce rapidly over.
As you could probably, hopefully that you took away from those videos right there, those videos follow a very sort of familiar narrative to me about the topic of invasive species for public. And most of us are really trained to condense this complex invasive species problem down to a fairly simple narrative, which we use. Anyway, there's a very important reason that we're doing this. It's a complex, large sort of scientific topic. We're condensing it down to a narrative for the public. And that narrative tends to follow this framing of, invasive species come from a different part of the world. They have XYZ negative impacts, and we need to manage or control their populations by engaging in some sort of solution. We as educators know, in order to make this framing work, we rely on a common set of strategies to really catch the public's attention. And that can include things such as fear appeals or appealing to people's fearful emotions, using invasion metaphors, relating invasive species are commonly related to aliens, invaders, enemies, like kind of like military type enemies. People also refer them to monsters. And we frequently employ militaristic or even violent type language to sort of describe invasive species themselves, as well as describe the impacts of invasive species and the way that we manage them. These narrative strategies are, of course, meant to inspire public urgency by painting invasive species as these negative moral actors, right? Things we don't want to have in our environment, and really appeals to humans' fear of outsiders and is meant to inspire the need to save or protect our natural lands from a common enemy. And based on our conversations internally here at the museum, but also through these conversations we've held with our workshop collaborators, where there's an increasing concern that these strategies may be somewhat effective for a variety of reasons. All right, next slide, please, Mason. Yeah, the first reason just being that it only, fear-based appeals especially tend to only inspire a short-term sense of urgency among the public. There's quite a bit of research suggests from within like the scientific communication field to suggest that people may become desensitized through repeated exposure to this type of messaging, because it inspires sort of these overwhelming negative emotional responses that our brains are really only able to tolerate and sort of synthesize for certain short periods of time. And this can lead to a large sense of fatalism amongst the public, right? This sense that our individual actions can't really make a difference against this larger problem. And that's not to say that fear-based appeals should never be used in our science communication. I just want to emphasize that. But it's more of just this growing awareness, at least amongst myself and my collaborators, that maybe we shouldn't be using these strategies in isolation with the public. Complementing this with other types of emotional appeals or approaches might be helpful in reducing some of these side effects of desensitization. So next slide, please. The other thing I just wanted to say briefly, and again, just piggybacking off of what Mason's already been mentioning, a lot of the current terminology also that's baked into the field of invasion biology, we're recognizing that it mirrors the political language that we use to talk about outsiders within the anti-immigrant or xenophobic rhetoric of the popular media. We found that the public has become increasingly sensitive to this rhetoric in recent years, of course, as world events are causing people to grapple with these complex problems of, or complex concept of, who does or does not belong in certain places. And regardless, sort of, despite the fact that, that is not the intention of our work and our rhetoric, just the fact that there are rhetorical parallels in our language does increase our risk of sort of inspiring negative emotional reactions or even distrust amongst our audiences and reducing public receptivity to our messaging. All right, next slide, please. And just a few, these are just some testimony from the workshop itself, giving a few examples of what was said during the workshop discussion. One individual felt that the public had sentiments of being overwhelmed or feeling defeated by invasive species and felt that it would be just easier to give up the work. And next slide, please. Another person said that using the terms native and invasive could sometimes be confusing contextually and lead to uncomfortable conversations with their audience members, including political conversations about things like immigration. And at time, the terminology they found falls in lines with eco-fascist talking points, and it felt that it was important to steer clear of talking with their audiences about invasive species in a way that it could be extended to human populations. All right, next slide, please. And briefly, I just wanted to mention too that another issue with the use of this framing, particularly I find in the use of extended metaphors, right? Metaphors that relate invasive species to these sort of negative moral actors or characters sort of in our public consciousness, like aliens or monsters. Another issue with this is that it does sort of artificially constrain our narratives and our conversations about invasive species with the public in a way that doesn't seem to provide a whole lot of space for explaining why invasive species cause harm and why their geographic origin is a relevant factor in that conversation, right? As we all know, invasive species are not typically an environmental problem within their indigenous range. It's through the process of obviously human introduction, human intervention, as well as sort of the certain mechanisms that occurred throughout their invasion pathway that cause them to take on these sorts of invasive type traits and have harmful effects in their introduced range, right? They can be released from natural enemies. They can undergo rapid evolution of increased competitive ability. There's all sorts of scientific hypotheses and reasons for why this occurs. You mind going next slide, please, Mason? All this just to say that without without providing ample space for this scientific nuance in our conversations with the public, it seems that the public we deprive the public of the ability to gain insight into why the origin of species matters when we're talking about these, when we have these conversations about, when we're judging the risks of invasive species and when we're talking about our management decisions, explaining why the origin matters is important, because otherwise it seems like folks have more space and capacity to jump to their own conclusions, right? Like apply their own paradigms, apply their own perspectives. And this can open the door to a more problematic interpretation, including xenophobic interpretations. And yeah, and just giving some examples of testimony from our workshop as well. One person found that there was difficulty trying to concisely and quickly communicate how invasive species are a serious threat to biodiversity. And next one, please. And some folks wanted to hear an easy solution in the public, but it's often not the case of explaining an easy solution. So again, it's a widely difficult, like universal challenge of explaining complex issues with the public. However, it is an important amount of nuance, I think, that needs to be added, especially because we see in the popular media that not only are we within the science communication community starting to voice some of these concerns, but the public and the media is starting to voice a lot of concerns and have these conversations themselves as well. People are, there's obviously media and folks having conversations about taking issues with this language, but also using it as a reason to question the legitimacy of the field of invasion biology, and even question the legitimacy of certain invasive species solutions, right, and management strategies. And by not participating in these conversations and evaluating our framing, we potentially risk disconnecting larger audiences from engaging in discussions about this really important environmental problem. Important environmental problem.
Yeah, that's what I was doing, just ignoring it, which isn't good.
I mean, there's not a lot of, I had a similar experience as well of like, we don't get a lot of formal academic training on rhetoric and science communication strategies. At least I didn't as a young scientist, and it wasn't until a lot later in my sort of educational training that I started to think about some of these challenges. Anyway, interestingly, sort of along the similar lines, there's been a large increase in this ethical sort of rhetoric question about invasive species being explored within the art community. And this is an example right here of it's a public art installation that occurred near Philadelphia's historic Chinatown. It was developed by the Asian Arts Initiative. It premiered earlier in the fall, and I believe it's now off display. But it used augmented reality to transform a section of the city called The Cut, which was an old abandoned railway that's been reclaimed by nature and weeds. And of course, that includes invasive species. And I'm just going to read a quick little excerpt from the website description. Around the globe, plants like people have always found ways to migrate, explore, and adapt. And yet the term invasive species is often used when referring to plants and bugs that are not native to a land, especially as they begin to have a noticeable or disruptive presence within the ecosystem. While the impact of that presence may be worth noting, what often goes undertold is the story of human interference that causes plant migration and abrupt changes to ecosystems. Without this piece of the narrative, the plant or bug itself becomes stigmatized as unwelcome and disruptive. The political implications of using the language invasive species becomes all the more problematic when considering the parallel to migration and displacement of people. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Mason. So again, and this example is really just meant to underscore just how widely pervasive these conversations are being had in both academic and scientific and also non-scientific spaces. And I believe this was a quote from—
This was me. I don't know. Okay, I'm going to go really quickly, but I just wanted to, this was a cool article on knotweed, which I have a sided research obsession with knotweed. And I just love this quote from this article from The Guardian. I think it's maybe a good quote to kind of end on before recapping. From the author, this plant has been brought over by human activity. So human beings cultivated it, encouraged it to grow, and it has just done what its biological nature impels it to do, which is spread and grow and reproduce. And the knotweed itself bears no guilt. It isn't a sort of sentient being. It is merely trying to live. And really, it is the human activity of industrialization and commercialization that has enabled its spread in the UK and in other countries. So So it's a question of, not what to do with knotweed is a commercial one. It's true, but it's also a philosophical one. And on the philosophical front, I think there is no cut and dried answer. And to me, that really called out, and this also the timing of this project that really called out as a good summary of kind of things that we're exploring. Okay, so I'm going to kick it back to you, Rachel, and you're going to go over some of the big take homes, and then hopefully we have some time for, because there's been an active chat and questions. So
as we've gone through this process of the last several months of having internal discussions here at the museum, as well as having discussions with our collaborators across other organizations, it's become very clear to us again that it's going to be difficult for us to inspire widespread community collective action unless we engage in a lot of these discussions about invasive species that are being had within the public space and elsewhere. And we need to find ways of shaping our language and messaging material that appeals to a modern audience. Based on our internal discussion, based on some of these discussions, we've come up with a set of personal best practices that we're trying to keep in mind as we're developing our own programming. The first one being, if you wouldn't mind going next slide. The first one is kind of an obvious one, but we are sort of filtering through a lot of our educational and programming material to identify and remove some of these outdated messages that can disconnect some of our audience members, and that especially being, removing things like fearful messaging, overuse of invasion type metaphors, and the use of militaristic language that may have this threat of taking on a xenophobic framing. And if you wouldn't mind going next slide, please. And in placement of taking away some of this old framework, we are working on finding new and compelling narratives that will appeal to the modern values and motivations held by our audience members who are looking to engage in land stewardship and invasive species management. So going back to those nature-based values that I mentioned earlier, we're searching for unique ways to find new emotional appeals and new types of stories and messaging that are connecting with folks. Obviously, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. In this case, our messaging is likely going to become a lot more diverse in order to sort of accommodate the diverse values and motivations held by our audiences. Next, we are working on providing added historical context and added sort of ecological scientific context about, especially when we talk about the origin of species and when we focus on the origin of species. So for example, when we're comparing differences in the environmental impacts of a native and a non-native species. Okay, I was just gonna say that just for the last 2 points, we also just have some missions of, again, ending conversations with positive, actionable local solutions and folding them into larger conversations about biodiversity and ecological resilience. Just with the broader goal of sort of incorporating some more positive type messaging.
All right, well, I'm going to just jump to the last slide. Sorry, Rachel, to kick you off. There's a QR code here that Rachel made. It's very generic, and you can of course always email us too. And at that QR code is a great place to just tell us what you think. What are your thoughts? What have you been working on? And in particular, thinking about as we work on this exhibition material and making an plant invasive species exhibit, what you think are the key points. So it's a relatively generic call, but one that I have a feeling like, judging on the active comments that I've been trying to look at too, that there's a lot of really great info and insight from folks. Cool. Thanks. And sorry for, we of course blathered on, and then also a little bit of technical difficulties. So cool. But geez, and well, we're down to 209. I think we were up to 260 at one point, which is no pressure or anything. And it's such a kind of a hot topic. So this is exciting. Shall I so what time is it? We really don't have a ton of time, but again, we're willing to stay, and we won't be offended if you have to leave, but we hope you can stay a little bit. Want me to just read off some of the questions?
Sure.
And Rachel,
We can take
Sure. Folks that love the native species are so sad when they are gone because of development or non-native invasive species. Is this enough to make our point? I think it's a great question by Mark and Lay here.
do you have any
maybe a quick response?
I was just say absolutely. I mean, especially for individuals of our community where native plant diversity is an important aspect of their motivations and values. And that was kind of one of our points we had in the takeaway about incorporating conversations about invasive species into the broad stewardship. One of those being, of course, biodiversity conservation and things like that.
Cool. And then we had another
so-
question asking to see the 4 bullets that you had here. So I just have those up now here.
Awesome.
I think, yeah, cool. Because that's when we were starting to break up a little bit. Got another question. Our question is how to message the value of using herbicides in an IPM approach when the public is very opposed to all chemicals. Yeah, I mean, that's also a really great question. I don't really know. I don't really have answers. And that was partly why we labeled this as brainstorming/exploring, because it really is a sticky subject. And I don't know if you have any comments, Rachel, on herbicide IPM approach. Honestly, it even goes as far as just like pulling invasives is somehow jarring for some people.
Yeah.
And of course, using herbicides is even more of a kind of like weighing the pros and cons and kind of explaining the full context of the situation. I don't know, Rachel, do you have anything more insightful on that?
Well, just the point too of, one thing to think about is how to frame it, right? Framing it as chemical application to eradicate an invasive species versus chemical application to, conserve biodiversity or to manage a property in a specific way. There are ways of potentially framing it that could improve sort of people's receptivity to those types of suggestions. The reality is too that certain portions of the public those types of management applications, and for those sorts of people, the second best approach might just be to recommend alternative non-chemical solutions, and there are ways that everyone can be able to contribute that aren't just like a one-size-fits-all sort of management solution.
Yeah, cool. You might want to turn your video off again. Sorry, Rachel, because I don't know, you're breaking up. Is there any federal effort to communicate about invasive species to the general public, especially about invasive landscape plants that people buy at places like Lowe's and Home Depots? And I'm not the best person to answer this, although I'd like to learn more about it. Just kind of following some other work, particularly like Bethany Bradley at UMass Amherst and others, these evaluations of kind of state level regulation on the landscape gardening plants. And it seems like, there's a lot of work has been done, but there's a lot of work to go. And to my knowledge, there's not much of a federal effort at that level, but and instead a lot of state to state inconsistencies, unfortunately. You provide a lot of information on what language not to use. What do you propose as an alternative? I mean, that's an awesome question, and one that I'm like, that now I have this interactions with exhibits in particular, and that opening exhibit story, to me, I really didn't even think it was like, I didn't really see that as being problematic, just kind of saying that invasive plants outcompete native plants as being something that might be problematic. And so that made me realize, wow, I have a long way to come in understanding other perspectives and how best to talk about it. And I think trying to get to the not, I have a kind of a more nuanced understanding now, I think, of instead of focusing on an individual species as being bad. I mean, it's definitely talk about case studies of invasive plants, but also talking about how they got here. What are their mechanisms? What are their impacts? And kind of framing it instead of, lesser celandine is bad, but instead discussing why, what is problematic about it, what are the impacts, and its introduction history as being a human caused issue. So yeah, I don't know.
Piggybacking off of that, Mason, yeah, I would very much emphasize the stories of placing humans at the center of a lot of the conversations and emphasizing the role of humans in history and perpetuating the invasive species problem, I think is there are a lot of very interesting, compelling sort of stories to be had that I think will capture the public's attention, but also it's a way of sort of shifting the blame away from like invasive species themselves and more towards people who have towards sort of humans and our history.
So similar question, can you offer suggestions of proactive things people can do to minimize the harm of invasives? I think that's kind of, that was kind of a similar question, but that's definitely something that like exhibit staff and museum is like all about. That's not something I usually think about as a scientist too much, to be honest, although I'm sure this group of natural areas practitioners think about this a lot. But it's a little bit uncomfortable territory instead of like just studying the invasive and being like, oh, well, what can be done about it? And of course, a huge one is like native, of course, like the native plant movement and planting natives instead of potentially invasives is a huge one, but that's of course easier said than done. And I think
I'm a very big fan of the, teaching about the precautionary principle as a solutions for the public. So just like you said, educating the public about, it's not even necessarily about how to get rid of invasive species. Obviously, that's a huge aspect of the solution, but also equally important is how not to implant new or how not to introduce new invasive species that are going to become environmental problems of the future.
Yeah. You have the questions up too. Gosh, there's a lot and they're great. I don't mean to be like boom, 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 boom. But I mean, all these we'll like stare at and chit chat about too. And like you said, we can follow up later. We're happy to keep going, but I don't know what you want to do.
And just so that I can say officially thank you while we still have people here, thank you so much. This is an amazing research, very thought-provoking. And I think when you tackle something like this, your first feeling is feeling overwhelmed, but then you just start to, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So, we'll just keep working through that. But thank you so much. For those of you who need to go, no problem. And we'll probably stay, maybe another 10 minutes. And if you want to raise your hand, we'll be happy to address you if you want to just go into more of a talk mode. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. Yeah, and I look forward to looking at all these comments too. There's a lot.
So maybe why don't we go ahead and let's just wrap up.
Yeah.
We really appreciate all that you've done. This has been terrific. I think it's the beginning of a longer dialogue, and clearly people are enthusiastic and ready to be a part of it. So thanks for the work you're doing, and we're going to be back in touch. And to all of you, you'll be hearing from us.